slides back there. So thank you all for joining us. I imagine it's been a long day. There's a lot of things that have happened. I'm sure we're coming into the end of it. So I want to make this as interactive as possible and as conversational as possible, because I think this is a really critical topic we need to talk about around how do we build equity in Web3. Oftentimes it's something that we just kind of take for granted, right? That it'll just happen. We're all going to make it, right? But what are the systems that we're creating for actually making sure that we all do really make it? And so with that, I'm really excited to have a group of folks here who are really working on the front lines of this. So I'll hand it over to them and have them introduce themselves. So we'll start right over here with Chinedu.
Hi, everyone. My name's Chinedu Onekwe. I'm the co-founder of African Digital Art. We are an ecosystem that is changing and revolutionizing the way that Black creators are funded through a crowdsourced design marketplace and a Web3-based NFT design competition.
Hi, everyone. I'm Dina Burke. I am wearing two hats here right now. One hat is that I work in marketing at the Sella Foundation. And my other hat is that I am co-founder of Boys Club, which is a community to onboard women to Web3. We do that in a variety of ways. We host events. We have a product studio, an incubator. We're spinning up an investment syndicate. And we are rolling out curriculum. And we have media and content as well. So it's a DAO. So there's lots of tentacles. We're building a world here. But yeah, that's basically me.
My name is Robbie Greenfield, CEO of Emerging Impact. And we build last mile payments infrastructure for emerging markets. So that's everything from USSD wallets to on and off ramps across sub-Saharan Africa, the US, and the United States with CUSD. And otherwise, we do a lot of work with humanitarian aid organizations in terms of leveraging our payment rails to facilitate humanitarian aid and also going into smallholder farmer financing as well.
So to kick things off first, I think all of you actually have really incredible and important insights and experiences that you're coming from in the different spaces that you're working in. So I think the first thing is actually defining the problem, right? Like, what do we mean by equity, and what are we trying to build towards? And so the first thing I actually want to ask, maybe for you guys to provide some perspective on, is when you think of building equity in Web3, right? What are the key problems that you're seeing in the spaces that you're operating in? That you're like, hey, we need to solve this? Any one of you?
For me, it's simply when, as we were designing our product, we are the largest Black digital creator collective in the world, over 7,000 creators, right? So we looked at where all people of color, Black people are, and said, to build a solution for them, we have to, have cash in and cash out solutions that work in different continents, works for different peoples of different levels of education. So we wanted to build inclusivity in from day one. So it was really, that informed a lot of our design choices. So Web3, when we were coming around to it, when you look at a lot of the players in it, and you talk to them about Africa, you talk to them about people with different levels of crypto nativity, it's not a concern, right? And the priority of prioritizing those people that look like me and look like our community just wasn't there. So to me, building inclusivity is building deliberately, and those people who are building deliberately for all people is what equity looks like. There are all people that are going to use everything, right? So why no one created an alphabet and then said that they did create an alphabet for their people, right? But so if you're creating a platform for people, who are your people, right? And that kind of defines, how you look at it. And if you look at it that your people don't include people that don't speak like you, that don't use your cash systems or rails, then you're not building for all people. You're limiting yourself. So we looked at platforms like Cello and platforms that are building to include us.
I think for me, I think there's that stat that goes around that's like less than 2% of VC funding goes to women. I'd like to see that change. But I think also, just more generally, with all due respect to all the crypto bros in the audience, I don't really see any, but if there are any, with all due respect, I think that that's dominated the narrative in Web3 up until this point. And it's a shame because there's a lot of incredible female-centered projects and female founders, and they just haven't gotten as much sunlight. And I think that's part of what we're trying to change in Boys Club.
Yeah, I would agree with definitely between equity and interface. So equity in terms of fundraising, I'll be the controversial person in the room. There are a lot of projects that have fundraised a great amount of capital with no traction. That is just a fact within the space, and it has a great preference toward people who are not people of color or people who are not women, and that's a continuous cycle toward where the now best projects are based off of that funding are doing well regionally as well, right? Because there is a geographic discrimination within that funding, right? And that's why you see a lot of African-based companies who may be registered in Delaware not receiving the same amount of money, or ones focused on black content creators, et cetera. So I think that's something that has to go away. And there's really no investment thesis that can prove that those investments are going to do better than the ones that do have traction, or from teams who are more diverse that are going to be able to spend, limited cash, more effectively. And then I say interfaces because additionally, DeFi is still very much obsessed with developing for iOS and developing for web and for Android a little bit. We're just starting to see, Android, operable, wallets. And this is crucial because, the vast majority of the people, and we're talking about billions of people, the vast majority of people on this planet do not have many of the interfaces or don't have the interconnection to maintain the interfaces that we're trying to provide them. And that's either via dApps or via wallets that aren't operable on interfaces or operating systems that are accessible. And so those two alone, close the door immediately, and you don't even get to protocols or tokens or any of the amazing things that you can do in terms of changing economic dynamics because the door is closed. And then beyond that, we can get into, how crypto economics might play a role in terms of, social or economic exclusion, in terms of collateralized loans and then needing 80 to 150%, et cetera. But, even before that, I think it's equity and interfaces.
Can I add something? So I think that's awesome. And I think one more thing to add is that, I'll speak for myself, it's not like diversity for diversity's sake. I think that how I'm sort of, from my vantage point, I'm seeing in this transition from Web 2 to Web 3, there's a lot of money that's moving around, there's a lot of power that's moving around, and there's a lot of decisions that are being made about designing for this future that we're all going to be living in, whether it's the metaverse or NFTs or crypto or Web3, whatever you want to call it, we're going to be there in 5 minutes. And right now, I see a lot of the same types of person making the decisions about what that future is going to look like. And I think that when I'm thinking about diversity, I'm really coming at it from that perspective more than anything else, which is I just want more people sitting around the table making those design decisions now, so that it's just more interesting for all of us for this future. So,
another thing I want to add so with Web3, and I think to me it's so critical that people that look like everyone are at the table very early, because everything is so permanent in it, right? Everything moves fast, but once you put something on the blockchain, it's permanent. So if the people who are in those decision making of who gets resources, and then also what gets on the chain and how does that look, and informing the people who will do that, right? It becomes a scenario to me where it becomes very troublesome that, people will make mistakes that they can't take back, right? And if you don't have the people at the table that are actually out supporting their interests to make sure they make the right decisions up front, because a lot of the conversations around equity and wealth don't happen in the communities that look like mine. So when they are making decisions to put their valuable assets on the blockchain, they are making an uninformed decision that is permanent, that can affect their livelihoods forever. And, you know, that has existed in Web 2. But, you know, eventually they could have, you know, I'm going to buy my master's in 20 years, right? That's something that they could do. But, you know, an asset that continues to accrue in value and equity that they won't be ever able to afford, you know, that won't happen, and there won't be any legal structure to make it happen. To me, I'm scared of that. I'm scared of that reality, so I'm fighting against it. That's why I'm doing what I'm doing. It has to happen so that people like us can actually have an equitable future.
They say if you're not at the table, you're on the menu, which rings true.
Yeah, actually jumping in on that, right? So I think, you know, the idea around decentralization was really kind of thinking about changing the power dynamics itself, right? Like, if we think of normal Web 2, it is a centralized entity that holds power. But then ideally in a decentralized system, we should be looking at a shift in power. Now the question is, I mean, there's a lot of people here in the audience. Now, a lot of people I imagine are building different projects. So do you have ideas for them of how do you actually create a new system of power, right? How do you actually decentralize that? Because if not, and we've seen it happen already in a number of different ecosystems, right? Of that decentralization of power doesn't actually happen. It's the same folks who had power previously retain power in a new system. So curious to know how, like, for folks listening here, how do you actually change that system of power itself?
Yeah, and I'll talk at the boring engineering level, because I see this a lot. I mean, at a protocol level, when it comes to developing your own tokens, it comes from, one, your token distribution strategy, and two, your rewards distribution models, right? Token distribution strategy, simply put, for people who are not familiar, who gets the tokens? Who gets the tokens at the beginning of the game? And if you have 100% of tokens and you're giving 40% to investors and 20% to the team, you failed immediately, just point blank. So anyone who's creating a white paper where that's your token distribution, you need to change it, because that's not decentralized, because you are creating, and I would imagine in a lot of these models, right, you're using those tokens as liquid governments, as liquid democracy. But if you have that type of distribution at the offset, then that means you have a plutocratic economy, right? And additionally, when it comes to like liquidity provision, so there's a lot of projects, they will allocate a certain amount of tokens to liquidity pools so that they can create value pairing with other, tokens, right? And thus their token has value, right? So, Celo with USDC or whatever, right? Or Robbie token with USDC or Robbie token with CUSD. The issue with that is that it actually is inflationary. And also, it's really important to note that liquidity providers typically will leave your ecosystem, like 48% of liquidity providers will leave your ecosystem as soon as your liquidity rewards stop. So why is that important? Because now you're creating an inflationary, lopsided economy that really isn't focused on creating the level of decentralization that you would want to create. But then lastly, I think, the whole basis of like token-based voting, I think has to be taken a look at, because is that the only form of voting that exists, right? Like to your point, right? If you have a token like Maker, for example, Maker was at $3,000, $5,000 at one point. You're effectively saying that certain people will never be able to participate in governance on protocols that might very much dictate how they live or how they access finance, right? If we talk about protocols that are developed for smallholder farmers and them not being able to use governance tokens to be able to dictate the economic parameters that they exist within. And so, you have to do more due diligence if you're going to go to the protocol route, not to focus on the money up front and to focus on how can I actually make this an equitable structure with on and off-chain tools to allow, the governance, to allow the liquidity to more naturally happen in a sustainable way, rather than taking, the 2017 ICO template of, I just want these tokens to reach $1 as soon as possible so I become a millionaire. And so, that's, at least for me, on the engineering side, is what I think is most important. It's usually not said, and so I said that.
That's an interesting component, because I don't want to geek out too much, but I loved conversations around participatory economics and then how you actually foster a system that can grow over time. And with us as an art-driven platform and our rewards mechanisms, we really spend a lot of time thinking about how the token takes away from the intrinsic motivation of creation of the creators and then skews back to the normative system that we are trying to get away from. So we're very keen on building attributes of how you earn and how do you retain and how do those people who are the actors that actually create the work, the creators are rewarded for what they do in a way that so basically, that is one of the greatest challenges, especially when you add other factors in. So for us, with the artistic and intrinsic motivation around creation, we wanted to make sure that if we created a really good platform and ecosystem, that we didn't replicate another system, and that system can pervert what creation is by itself. And to do that, like what we were informed by, this to me, and this I would have to say, I have to give this attribute to Beatrice Ramos, who basically created, she created Dada, which is a platform around artists in New York, and she spent a lot of time around this, and so that informed our thinking around how do you, and they created like the second NFT, which is Creeps and Weirdos. And so we spent a lot of time talking with her about how do you create an ecosystem that supports the artist and continues to do so over time as the works and the value of that work increases. So I think it's very important to like really spend a lot of time up front, because again, it becomes permanent, even though you can adjust things over time, but you really have to spend a lot of time around what you're trying to build and try to think through the failings of all other economies that you've ever seen. So it's difficult, but.
I think it's a little bit different for us. I mean, we don't have a protocol yet, but it's in the works. But basically, like, Boys Club is it's an education platform that's disguised as a media brand, and one thing that we are really mindful of is that most of our members don't have wallets. Like, we're setting them up with their wallets for the first time, and so education is a big part of like what we're doing day in and day out. And I think that for us, there's a really big responsibility on making sure that the language that we use and how we speak to the people in our community and who are interested in becoming part of our community, we're speaking to them in such a way so that they feel like this is a world for them, and that we don't get bogged down in the language that we're all using in this room, right? Like we are workers in translating that, and I think that that's sort of it's tangential to your question, Nikhil, but that's really how we're thinking about this sort of democratization, is that we need to be really intentional about reaching different communities, and we do that through language.
Thanks. And we have about 12 minutes left. I do want to give a chance for other folks in the audience to also jump in with any questions or comments as well. It's a little bright, so I can't necessarily see everything.
So while we wait for the audience, I want to double down on this language component, right? Because like for us at ADA, what the most frequent comment that we get on our blog is, "This is dope," right? Like from all the art. Like no one's talking about a wallet, no one's talking about crypto and coins. No one's talking about that. People like it, right? And giving people what they like. There's a conversation that we had with one of our community members named Tuma Basa. He's the head of YouTube's like Black culture kind of thing. And he said to us, what unlocked hip hop was streaming, right? There's so many decision makers in the music entertainment industry that really tried to manufacture the image of what people were doing every day in urban communities and translate that into a marketing package that they would then sell, that limited the actual ceiling of what was the consumption of what people liked, right? So similarly, when you look at the art market for us, the same thing happens when you see so many. You might see somebody like Basquiat being, he's like 80% of the black art market, and then you have some of these artists that are doing great work and selling for $20,000 to $50,000 or maybe $2 million with a Sotheby's auction. But it's the same situation, right? But ultimately, when people get their eyes on what they want, they just want it. You have to give it to them. They have to be able to see it. And I think all of the things that we're saying about equity is, if we just give everyone the chance to go through the same pipes as everyone else, things will be a lot fairer, and when things are fair, a lot of people have better lives, right? The whole hip hop entertainment industry, there's so many people that are living off of that they wouldn't have before, just because of streaming, even though there's an issue with streaming. But, it's, to me, allowing people to like what they like, get what they like, and only have to know that they like it is what, our biggest challenge, and it's around language that we're trying to do it. So how do you get this piece of art? Just get it. That's what we're trying to do, and make it a simplistic, seamless process of doing those things. And I just love what you just said there. Language is the most important.
Yeah, I think we're trying to move away from this word onboarding and frame it as welcoming instead, because onboarding is so clinical and what am I doing? But really, ultimately, it's about sort of figuring out ways to make people feel welcome in this space. And that's truly the work of it. The sort of functional stuff aside, that's really what we're all trying to do here.
Another thing I've been wondering, right, is as you guys have been speaking, for me, I think it's always been, in Web3, it's an opportunity to create something new, right? And there's different models to that. Either it's something that, hey, you couldn't do this at all in the first place. It just wasn't possible. Or there's actually things that were being done in other communities that wasn't actually being used before. So for me, recently, it's been really emphasizing on community-based finance, right? Something that I would argue we kind of lost a lot of that, right? In the heyday of the rise of investment banks, we actually moved very dramatically away from that when we think of large movements of money. Whereas Web3 actually allows you to do some of those things that you just couldn't. So curious to know, as you guys are building, as you guys are working on different projects, do you envision more kind of creating entirely new models, or do you also see things that, hey, these are things that we haven't actually looked to build further, right? And these can particularly come from communities that have oftentimes been ignored or not really looked at when it comes to economic development and social relations. I'm curious to know if you guys have thought about that.
Yeah, I don't know if this is exactly answering your question. It's a very smart question, unsurprisingly. But I think that one thing that comes up for us a lot is we're the Genesis insight for Boys Club was this idea that for a lot of people, for a lot of women, a certain type of woman, learning, they're not going to go down the crypto rabbit hole, the Web3 rabbit hole, and it's not going to be they're not going to enjoy doing it as a solitary experience where they're on their laptop learning by themselves. The real sort of insight was there's folks that want to learn in community. And so the Boys Club is facilitating that through events and other things. But I think one thing, the behavior that we're looking at and that we're looking for is really it's still human connection. And I think that we're just trying to map to that as much as we can. And so I don't know that there's anything revolutionary in it, but I think we're just seeing Web3 as a way to sort of facilitate this more profound human connection between people. And I think that's ultimately what we're trying to do.
Yeah, I mean, I think in what we see, so Emerging Impact, we started, only on distributing digital humanitarian aid. And so the reason I bring that up is because some of the things are recreating things that weren't already accessible in the first place, right? So, the ability to receive money in a reusable way and not use a paper voucher, for example. I think that upon those building blocks, in really extreme circumstances where you enable something that wasn't already accessible but is normal to a lot of other people, particularly in the West, you then come across how you can extend that opportunity into things that were never before seen. So, for example, if you can accept payments, low-cost payments via USSD on a feature phone, It was like, okay, then you can access yield accounts, right? Which you could never access. And in a lot of cases, you'd never access savings at all, right? Or you're accessing savings that is much, much, much lower than, stable coin like yield percentage. And then if you can access, savings, then you can access financing, and then you have to stop. And it's like, okay, well, what type of financing do we want to enable people to access? And that's where I think some of the things you might not want to recreate in the same way. You might want to create more, risk mitigating factors in order for somebody to avoid default completely. Or you might want to take, ideas from other protocols like self-paying loans so that even if someone defaults, they never actually default because the loan will be paid off eventually, right? And I think that's where the new and the pre-existing have to be developed in a way that actually serves, those who, have the most need in mind, rather than, what we've seen a lot of, which is more on the gambling side, for people who have a lot of income and just want to generate a whole bunch of yield or want to, algorithmically trade and borrow and things like that. So I think, but the issue, and I think you brought this up earlier, is that narrative is so dominant that what could be new and incredibly economically transformative, but yet simple, is overlooked.
Yeah, and for us, I think that we're not really, like, in all the initiatives that we have on our that we're building, none of it doesn't exist already in the Web 2 or just in real life experience. Like, we're building a DAO to fund creative projects. Commas exist, like in Kenya, people get together, pull their money together. There's different forms all around the global south. They call it different names. A lot of that money doesn't go into creative projects, right? Because it's very kind of untransparent around how creative projects can be valued. So I think, like, looking at, like what you said, like, if we recreated what already exists offline and wanted to recreate it online, would you want the art market as it currently is recreated online, as intransparent as it is and how crazy it is? No, I don't want that. I don't want it to even exist as it is. Right? So to try to change that is to say, how do I get those, get the transparency and actually get the community involved early in identifying their own creative talent, support them with the resources that they have, create a transparent wallet so they can see when those funds are dispersed, and they actually vote on the disbursement of those funds into those emerging creators. And oh yeah, let's identify projects or antiquities that we want to return back to ourselves and bring that and turn them into virtual projects. So for us, we thought about it that way. And because we've been around since 2009, we had the ability to look at what was even being created in Web3 as it is. And I wouldn't say second mover advantage, but we could see that most NFT marketplaces were basically telling creators, go out and create your own community and then come back to us with that community. Thank you for doing that hard work. And then try to sell your product. We had the opportunity to say, that doesn't make sense. Why don't we do community as a service? So that's how we think about what we're doing. We're thinking community is the service that we do as a platform for our creators, and we think about them first, and we're trying to recreate what would be the better world that we thought should exist. So I think that is really like the opportunity that Web3 provides. It's like that dream that you had, that you were talking about at late night in college or something, that you wanted to exist, that you didn't think exists, let's try it. Let's try to make that happen. And I think that's what we're trying to do.
So we got 1 minute and 20 seconds left. For the audience members here, what can they, when they're leaving this room, right, and they're leaving this conference, what would you like them to take away from this conversation?
Hire women. We have if you need help, I'm happy to help you. We have a job board. Yeah, I think that there's no pipeline issue. You just have to do the work. So I think that's the big thing for me.
I would say look toward partnership before building from scratch. Especially, in this ecosystem, a lot of the components and tools to build for the communities with the cultural constraints that are going to enable those communities to thrive, I think already exist in some form. And not to think that you have to, recreate everything. Look for more partnerships, be more outward going, I think was what I would say.
Partner with us if you are a brand, cause, or celebrity, or no one. Tell them to come to ADA, come to Nandi, and we will help them get into Web3 and use our community to support them. So that's what I was saying.
Amazing. Thank you. And as Dina said, do the work. Thank you all for joining.